So it's my huge pleasure to invite to speak first the first ever UKIP MP and someone who really gave us fantastic momentum at the end of the summer into the autumn to the point where we're very competitive right across the country with less than 3 weeks before polling day at a general election. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Douglas Carswell.
Good evening, and thank you for that warm introduction and warm welcome. It's a particular pleasure to be here in Cambridge supporting Patrick. When I was toying with the idea of changing parties, of joining UKIP, I was enormously encouraged in that decision by the fact that Patrick had joined UKIP. Patrick was a highly respected and able journalist. He's a highly respected economics graduate, and when I saw Patrick joining UKIP and speaking up on behalf of UKIP, it really had quite a big impact on me and my decision to change parties. And Patrick gave me enormous encouragement. During the by-election, Patrick not only came and canvassed and leafleted, but he gave me a lot of advice as to what to say and how to address the electorate and on public speaking. And so it's wonderful and a real honour and privilege to be here supporting his campaign in Cambridge tonight. I'm quite often asked when I go around and speak to an audience, what did it feel like being UKIP's first ever elected MP? What was it like walking into the House of Commons for the very first time? Imagine, there are 649 MPs crammed into the Commons chamber and just one of me. And let's be honest, they're not all best pleased to see me. What did it feel like? Well, practical questions like, where was I going to sit? Where does UKIP's first elected MP sit in the Commons chamber? Now, I couldn't go over there and sit with the Conservatives. I just left them. I wasn't exactly going to go and sit next to Ed Miliband because I've been against all that sort of stuff all my life, and I didn't really fancy going and cozying up to George Galloway on the back benches up at the top. So where should I sit? Well, I decided to sit where Gladstone's old Liberal Party, when we had a proper Liberal Party in this country, I decided to sit where his party sat. Gladstone's old Liberal Party, who believed in low tax, minimal government, accountable government, and Gladstone's party that was very sceptical of military adventurism overseas. And I felt that was the place in the House of Commons where I think UKIP should feel at home and feel comfortable. Now, when I decided that I was going to make that part of the House of Commons my perch, I discovered that there were a group of rather old-fashioned Labour MPs that had decided to make that part of the House of Commons their home. And they weren't best pleased when I decided to make their perch my base in the Commons. And now, I don't know if you know, did you ever see that TV programme, Inside the Commons? It was on television quite recently. And it showed that when there's a rather odd system for deciding where you sit in the chamber of the House of Commons. You have to fill in what's known as a prayer card, and you have to fill in the prayer card, get that really early, and put the prayer card in a little slot. Think of it as a bit like sort of a beach towel for Germans. You sort of fill it in and bag it, and that's your slot for the rest of the day. I got in there really early, and I filled in my prayer card, and I put it in the chair, and I went away for a couple of hours, came back, and I noticed that on my prayer card were written the letters F-O. What could they mean? I thought this was encouragement. Clearly they wanted me to join the Foreign Office. Perhaps as the last Minister for Europe. Now, I can tell you one thing. They're going to have to make a lot more room for many more UKIP MPs after May the 7th. I've been doing a lot of campaigning recently. This is, I think, the 8th or 9th seat that I've gone to support since the campaign started, but I spent a great deal of my time in Clacton, in my constituency, And when you're out knocking on doors, you get to see life and human nature in all its rich and varied tapestry. And I just wanted to pass on a couple of little anecdotes fresh from the front line in Frinton. Frinton had some wonderfully big houses and a couple of rather large brick Victorian houses, the sort of houses that have very long sort of gravel drives. And I was out knocking on doors in Frinton recently, and I walked up one gravel drive, and as I got to the front door, I noticed the front door was slightly open, ajar. And I sort of knocked on the door, rapped rather loudly, and as I did so, I noticed this music in the background. And I waited a bit, and I knocked again, and this little sort of head popped out from behind the door, and these two sort of eyes glared up at me. And I noticed this sort of young lad wearing what looked a bit like a sort of smoking jacket, but with the sleeves rolled up. And he had in one hand what looked suspiciously like a cigarillo. And he had in the other hand what looked like a glass of suspiciously like brandy. And I said to the young lad, "Excuse me, are your parents at home?" And he looked up at me and said, "Does it ruddy look as if they're at home?" You get to see human nature in all its rich tapestry without canvassing. Now, I wanted to talk to you this evening about democracy. I came in here this evening and like you, I met some of our fellow residents who were protesting, and one of them said to me, "It's a democracy." And it is a democracy, and that's a wonderful thing. It's really important that people are able to express different points of view. They're free to be completely wrong-headed, and that's fine. But what should, other than the freedom to express your opinions, however daft and batty, what should democracy look like? What would a good system of democracy be like? And I would put it to you that if democracy worked, there would be a system of competition, of choice and competition. People would need to compete for our votes. They would need to compete for our support. And there would be competition to get into office and to hold office and to make public policy. And this process of choice and competition would mean that we had innovation and better government, better governance. Now, there would be choice and competition between people to hold office, and there would be choice and competition between different ideas, between different ways of doing things. That's what democracy ought to be like. But what is democracy like in practice in this country today? In many, many seats in this country, up until now, and I stress up until now, we've had safe seats. In 7 out of 10 seats in this country, there's been very little choice and competition between the different parties. 7 out of 10 seats up until now has been a safe seat. In 4 of the past 5 general elections, fewer than 1 in 10 seats have changed hands. Even in the great Labour landslide of 1997, that once-in-a-generation landslide, only 3 out of 10 seats changed hands. Think that through. That means that up until now, if you're an MP, you've very little chance of losing your job because you fall out with the voters. You've a much greater chance of falling out with your party, losing the party whip. So what do MPs do? They answer inward to whips, to other MPs. Think about how it is that under this system of rotten safe seats, of rotten boroughs, think about how it is that many people become MPs in the first place. I looked at, and I must confess, I don't tend to read The Guardian very often, but I did read it recently, and I saw a fascinating piece of analysis done in The Guardian, and it showed that, I think I'm right in saying, 6 out of 10 candidates in Labour and Conservative seats that they were hoping to win at the next election, 6 out of 10 of them, 6 out of 10 of these candidates were already working in Westminster. You have to work in the office of an MP to become an MP under this existing system of safe seats. That doesn't mean choice and competition over who gets to be our MPs. That means one group of politicians selecting the next generation of politicians who select the next crop of politicians. Is it any wonder we end up with people like Matt Hancock and Ed Balls running this country's economy? I think we can do better than this. Politics in this country has become a cartel, a fix. It's rigged by the political parties in Westminster for the convenience of career politicians in Westminster. You know, I'm not a socialist. But there was once a good, honest, honourable tradition in the Labour Party of standing up for the interests of organised labour. The Labour Party represented unashamedly the sectional interest of Labour, and the Conservative Party represented unashamedly the interests of business. Both of them represented competing sectional interests. You may agree or disagree, but they did so honestly. Both parties have completely lost touch with their sectional interests. The only sectional interests they represent today are the sectional interests of career politicians in Westminster. This is what's going on. Let me give you a couple of examples of how the political parasites in Westminster have hijacked our democracy. Until 1968 in this country, it was illegal to put the name of a party on a ballot paper. The law expected you to vote not for a party, not for a line to take, not for a message concocted by Linton Crosby or Axelrod in Westminster. The law expected you to vote for a person with their perspective, their views and their values. How many people under our current system do that? They changed the law, they changed the rules so that people had to vote for a party rather than a person. All the rules to do with party election broadcasting and they're rigged in favour of the big corporate parties against the personalisation of politics that we know. Until the 1930s in this country, those that you elected to the House of Commons had a genuine say over how taxes were spent. In the 1930s, a coalition government came together in the national interest, sound familiar, and rigged the rules in the House of Commons so that individual MPs could no longer table amendments to the budget. Now think about that. The whole reason we have a Parliament, the whole reason we have a House of Commons, going back to the 1640s, when we cut the King's head off to make the point, was that we decided how our taxes were spent by sending elected representatives to a legislature to decide. Up until the 1930s they could do that. Since the 1930s, the only thing an MP can do is cheer yes or no on budget day. They have no real control over how our taxes are spent. So since the 1930s, of course, the share of GDP consumed by government has gone up and up and up. And the House of Commons has become redundant. No longer are tax and spend decisions really decided by those that you elect. No longer are tax and spend decisions really made on budget day after consideration of thought and debate in the House of Commons. They're made by the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen. I sat in the House of Commons in 2009 and listened to Labour MPs cheer a budget without understanding that what they were cheering was going to double the income tax rate of those on low incomes. They simply don't understand what it is that they're doing on budget day. And we wonder why people have lost confidence in our politicians. Until the 1970s in this country, the House of Commons decided what was and what was not the responsibility of a minister. Until the 1970s, it was the House of Commons that decided the departmental responsibilities of Whitehall. Since then, of course, the big parties in Westminster have rigged the rules. Today, it's a tiny clique sitting on the sofa in Downing Street that decides what ministers do and what their responsibilities are. Think about that. A sofa gang sitting on the sofa in Downing Street. We heard about sofa government under Tony Blair. Sofa government under Tony Blair. It was still a sofa government under Gordon Brown. It's still a sofa government under David Cameron. It may be a different clique, but it's always the same sofa. I think we can do better than this. I think we can do better than be governed by a small clique of unelected, unaccountable special advisors sitting on that Downing Street sofa. We need change. We need far-reaching change. Because politics has become a cartel, because it's been captured by people at the top of the big corporate parties in Westminster, we don't get choice and competition over ideas. A successful free society needs to have competition over different ways of doing things. Why? Because the world's changing. The world's full of change. The world's full of innovation. And new things come along, which means that the old ways of doing things become redundant. And you need to find new ways of doing things. Let me give you an example. We had a bank crisis in this country. A bank crisis that meant we had to spend billions of pounds bailing out banks. Has there been any real bank reform since? No. The big two parties have simply agreed to bail out the banks and to give the regulators and the banks even more power. Look at energy policy. Yeah? There's no choice in competition between the two established parties. Ed Miliband passed the legislation that established those renewable targets. He enshrined in law outdated ways of thinking about energy, ways of thinking that assumed the world was running out of oil, that assumed the oil price was going to go up and up and up. Instead, it's fallen. Outdated ways of thinking that assumed the world was running out of fossil fuel. Then along came shale gas. Ways of thinking that put wind power over and above solar power. Now I think we can see that that dependence upon subsidised wind energy was wrong. And yet neither of the two parties in this election are offering us real alternatives. Then trade policy. Both established parties in Westminster agree that this country's trade relationship must mean tying ourselves to the world's only declining trade bloc. 40 years ago, I can understand why people might have thought that the European Union, or what became the European Union, was the future. It seemed to be growing. It accounted for 38% of global GDP when we went in. Today, the European Union is in decline. Well, China has grown, India's grown, Brazil's grown enormously since the banking crisis. Since 2007, the only indices in Western Europe that have grown are those that gauge debt and unemployment, and yet still the Tweedledee and the Tweedledum parties say we must trade exclusively. We must be in this close relationship with the world's only declining trade bloc. It prevents us from trading with where the growth is. And look at the issue of labour mobility. Later this evening, I'm going to go back to London, and I'm going to go on the London Underground, and I'm going to be one of 4.4 million people today who travel on the London Underground using an Oyster card. I'll log in and I'll log out. Modern technology allowing the mass movement of people without queues. If you can have a system that allows you to log in and log out when you go onto the London Underground, why can't you have a system that uses the same technology to log people in and log out when they cross our borders? Defence. I think the world is seeing new dangers emerge. It's important not to exaggerate it, but I'm concerned about it. I look at Putin and I think he spells trouble. I think Russia's Putin spells real trouble. I look at the Middle East and it bothers me. It concerns me. What's happening in the southern Mediterranean and the eastern Mediterranean alarms me. Well, consider this. At the time of the first Iraq war, we had in this country, stationed not far from here, 19 RAF squadrons. Today we have a mere 7. We spend in this country each year £36 billion on defence, and we're overstretched and under-resourced. And yet we spend £12 billion on overseas aid. I know how we could solve many of our problems, our fiscal problems. We need to reprioritise our country's spending, away from what was seen as being priorities 10, 15, 20 years ago. The world is changing. We need politicians who can change the way they spend our money. You know, UKIP to me is about making sure we break that cartel in Westminster. We need choice and competition back in our politics. And simply by voting for UKIP, by voting for Patrick O'Flynn here, or by voting for Pete Reeve, you're voting to break that cartel in Westminster. You're voting to change things. We had in this country, and I'll give you a metaphor, I think it is, or it's a simile, I forget. For years and years in this country, we had the same supermarkets. Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Morrison's, Waitrose, if you're that way inclined. And they told us that they were giving us value for money. And then along came Aldi and Lidl. I know that from Germany. We in UKIP are in favour of international trade and internationalism. Along came Aldi and Lidl, and they broke that monopoly. They broke that cartel. We started to see what real value looked like. And we need that in our politics. We need UKIP. We need UKIP to come in to hold that block of MPs in the House of Commons after May the 7th, making sure that we get change. UKIP isn't just the change in itself. UKIP's manifesto also represents a real chance for change. UKIP's manifesto, I don't know if you've had the chance to look at it, but seriously, do look at it. It is an extraordinary document. It's been properly costed. None of the other parties, not one of the other parties, has done what we've done. We handed our manifesto and its sums to a third party, and we got them to check it. A highly respected city independent think tank. We got them to check our numbers, and they signed off on it. We're the only party that's done that. It's a proper, credible manifesto. It doesn't rely on the magic money trick. It relies on real sums and real maths. But I find the most exciting parts of our manifesto aren't those that deal with deficit reduction and fiscal policy. They're those that offer us political reform. And I think there are three things that really stand out in that manifesto. The first is UKIP will give people the power to recall their MPs, the power to sack their MPs. If your Member of Parliament has broken their promises, if they're lazy, if they fiddle their expenses, if they haven't honoured their promise, I think local people should be able to trigger by-elections. Now, I'm not afraid of by-elections. I don't know why so many people in Westminster are afraid of by-elections. I think if you're in a job and the boss says they want someone else, there's no disgrace in being sacked. And I think MPs should be sacked if voters think that someone else could do that job better. We need to give people the power to trigger by-elections so that MPs who answer to other MPs rather than outward to their constituents can be replaced. Too many seats in this part of East Anglia are private property of political parties. Too many MPs in East Anglia have been MPs in East Anglia for years and decades. And I think we need the power of recall so that people can have real choice and competition as to who represents them. We also need, I think, electoral reform. I think it would be extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary, if after May the 7th we discovered that the SNP, for example, with 2.5–3% support in the polls nationally, if they were to end up with 20, 30, 40 MPs, that would be bizarre. I think we need electoral reform to make sure that every vote counts, to make sure that there's no such thing as a one-party fiefdom, a safe seat. And we set out ideas in our manifesto to make sure that we get real reform, real political reform. I'm really just going to wrap up my remarks. I was told to speak for 20 minutes, and it's 22 minutes since I got to my feet. Really just by saying this. Because UKIP stands for change, many of the vested interests, the big corporate political parties and the big corporate media are desperate to stop us. And they're going to throw everything at us. And one thing they throw at us is that we're pessimists. No, we're not. We want change. I believe this is an extraordinary country, a quite remarkable country. We may only be 1% of the land surface of the planet, but look at what this extraordinary country has achieved. The world speaks our language. Our common law has spread to every continent. We sell vodka to the Russians, for goodness sake. We sell cheese to the French. We sell software to India. This is an extraordinary country, a remarkable country. How much better wouldn't we be if we could actually have a political system that believed in Britain, that believed in self-government, and that answered to us? Thank you.